have been discussing our lecture series on epistemology introduced in the new NEP-UGCF, University of Delhi 6th semester for our BA Honours Philosophy students. Of course, epistemology is a paper where everyone can learn from. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor, Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, we have had discussed the various sources of knowledge, and we are going ahead today of epistemology with the theme on skepticism. Now, the first question that comes to all of us is, what is skepticism? Skepticism is a philosophical attitude or approach that questions whether certain knowledge or absolute certainty is possible. It does involve a critical examination of the grounds for our beliefs and claims to knowledge challenging the assumptions and evidence upon which those beliefs are based. If we are to talk thus about some of the key aspects of skepticism, we can begin with by talking about first epistemological skepticism. Now, to define epistemological skepticism, we would define it as the view that we may not have sufficient justification to claim that any of our beliefs are absolutely true or certain. It asks the question, how can we know what we know? So the core question is, it challenges the reliability of our senses, reasoning and even memory, prompting us to consider whether our knowledge is merely based on assumptions, perceptions or cultural constructs. Now, degrees of skepticism, there is something called radical skepticism. Now, when we talk about the degrees, we would navigate how from radical to moderate or methodological skepticism has evolved over time. Now, radical skeptics argue that knowledge is either extremely limited or entirely impossible. They question whether we can know anything beyond our immediate subjective experiences. Now, moderate or methodological skepticism of many philosophers such as René Descartes have used skepticism as a methodological tool. Descartes famously doubted all his beliefs to find a foundation of certainty, resulting in his cogito ergo sum conclusion. This form of skepticism is not an end in itself, but a way to critically evaluate and establish stronger grounds for knowledge. Now, let's talk about the historical context of skepticism. How did skepticism evolve, and why are we even talking about it today under the paper Epistemology? Ancient skepticism. Now, in ancient Greece, figures like Philo of Eleusis and the academic skeptics questioned the possibility of certainty in knowledge. They promoted practices such as epoche, which is basically suspension of judgment, to achieve mental tranquility. Modern skepticism. Now, during the modern period, thinkers like Descartes and David Hume expanded on skeptical ideas. Descartes used skepticism as a tool to discard unreliable beliefs, while Hume questioned the justifications of causality and the nature of the self, influencing modern empiricism and the philosophy of science. Now, let's also go to the purpose and value of skepticism, something called critical examination. Skepticism serves as a valuable tool in philosophy and science. By questioning the foundations of knowledge, skeptics encourage rigorous analysis and help to avoid dogmatism. Self-correction. Through a skeptical inquiry, one is encouraged to continually re-examine and refine one's beliefs and theories in light of new evidences or arguments. So where is the balance? While some forms of skepticism might lead to extreme doubt, moderate skepticism aims to strike a balance, acknowledging the limits of human knowledge while still seeking reliable methods to understand the world. Now let's talk from the contemporary perspectives, philosophical inquiry. Modern debates often involve the limits of perceptual knowledge, the reliability of memory, and the role of cognitive biases. Skepticism remains a key component in discussions about scientific methodology, ethics, and even political discourse. Pragmatic considerations. While radical skepticisms might lead to a paralyzing doubt, many contemporary thinkers advocate for a pragmatic approach. This recognizes that while absolute certainty may be unattainable, we can still build practical and coherent systems of knowledge that work effectively in everyday life. So in summary, skepticism is both a challenge and a tool in the pursuit of knowledge. It encourages us to critically assess our assumptions, explore the limits of what we can know, and continuously seek better evidence and arguments. By doing so, skepticism helps foster a more reflective, cautious, and ultimately more robust approach to understanding the world. Now, how do we trace skepticism's evolution? Philosophical skepticism, the view that we should withhold assent from beliefs lacking sufficient justification, has a long and varied history. Its origins and development can be traced through several key periods and figures. For instance, ancient Greek roots, Pyrrhonism. We have talked about Pyrrho is often regarded as the founder of skepticism in the Western tradition. He observed that for every argument there seems to be an equal and opposing one, leading him to the conclusion that certainty is unattainable. Epoche and atarxia. Pyrrhonicists advocated for epoche or suspension of judgment as a way to achieve ataraxia, which is a state of mental tranquility free from the disturbances of dogmatic beliefs. Academic skepticism, Plato's Academy. If we are to talk about that, we see that although Plato himself was not a skeptic, his student initiated what is known as academic skepticism. This school questioned the possibility of certain knowledge, arguing human perceptions and reason are insufficient to reach absolute truth. We also see that later certain advances in skeptical arguments by demonstrating that both sides of an argument could be defended, thereby challenging the idea of objective truth and certainty. Medieval and early modern developments, integration with religious thought. Now, during the Middle Ages, skeptical arguments were less prominent due to the dominant role of religious and theological certainty. However, the underlying doubts about human reason and sensory experience continued to influence later thinkers. Now, during the medieval and early modern developments, we also have the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, where there was a renewed interest in empiricism and reasoning. The rediscovery of classical texts during the Renaissance, along with advances in science, brought renewed attention to skeptical arguments. Thinkers began to reconsider the limits of human knowledge in light of empirical evidence and rational inquiry. Now let's talk about modern philosophical skepticism, René Descartes, the very famous methodological skepticism. So, as we can see on the slide here, Descartes is famous for his method of systematic doubt in his meditations on first philosophy. He famously questioned everything that could be doubted, from the reliability of the senses to the existence of an external world, in order to establish a foundation for indubitable knowledge. Cogito ergo sum. His ultimate conclusion, I think, therefore I am, emerged as the one certainty that could not be doubted, setting the stage for modern epistemology. Now, under modern philosophical skepticism, we also have David Hume, well known for his empirical skepticism. So Hume took skepticism further by questioning the justifiability of causation, the self, and even inductive reasoning. He argued that much of what we take to be knowledge is based on habit and custom rather than rational proof. Further, the impact on science and philosophy, we see that Hume's skepticism profoundly influenced later empiricists and has continued to shape debates in epistemology, metaphysics, and the philosophy of science. Now, the later developments and contemporary perspectives, if we talk about Immanuel Kant, we see that in response to Hume, Kant sought to reconcile skepticism with the possibility of certain knowledge. He argued that while we cannot know things as they are in themselves, noumena, we can have valid knowledge of phenomena as they appear to us, structured by our cognitive faculties. Contemporary skepticism. Now, moving on from rational skepticism, empirical skepticism, we are introducing to a new theme, which is modern skepticism. Modern philosophers continue to grapple with skeptical challenges. Debates focus on issues such as the limits of perceptual experience, the role of social and linguistic practices in forming knowledge, and the nature of subjective versus objective reality. So we see that the historical origins of philosophical skepticism lie in the ancient Greek tradition, where thinkers like Philo and the academic skeptics first articulated doubts about our capacity for certain knowledge. This tradition was further developed and transformed through the works of Descartes and Hume in the modern era, setting the stage for ongoing debates in epistemology and philosophy of mind. Skepticism remains a vital part of philosophical inquiry, continually challenging us to critically examine the foundations of our beliefs and the nature of knowledge itself. Now, skepticism, if we are to further talk about it, about the minds, is a classic philosophical problem that questions how we can know that minds other than our own exist. This skepticism arises from the fact that we do not have direct access to the thoughts, feelings, or consciousness of others. We can only infer their mental states based on their external behavior. The problem can be framed in terms of the broader issue of epistemological skepticism, how we know anything at all, but with a specific focus on the minds of others. So, some of the key perspectives on this issue is, of course, when it comes to skepticism, has to be the problem of other minds. Now, what is this problem of the other minds? The core issue is that we only experience our own mind directly through introspection. Other people's mental states are not directly observable. We infer them from external cues like speech, facial expressions, and actions. The skeptic argues that such inference might be unreliable. Perhaps others are zombies, in philosophical sense, who lack consciousness but behave as though they have minds. 2. The argument from analogy. One classical response proposed by John Stuart Mill and others is the argument from analogy, which is, I have a mind and experience mental states, pain, pleasure, When I exhibit certain behaviors, example wincing, crying, they correlate with my mental states. Other people exhibit similar behaviors under similar circumstances. Therefore, it is reasonable to infer that they also have similar mental states. Objection: this argument generalizes from a single case, one's own mind, which may be weak epistemologically. Now, the problem of induction. Skeptics argue that the argument from analogy relies on inductive reasoning, which is itself susceptible to doubt. Just because certain behaviors correlate with mental states in my own case does not necessarily mean the same is true for others. The inference of the best explanation. Now, this is yet another issue with skepticism. Some philosophers argue that the best explanation for human behavior is that others have mind like ours. If we reject this explanation, we must assume an unlikely alternative, that is, that are people who are automatons who merely simulate conscious thought. This is a more robust response to skepticism than the argument from analogy. Wittgenstein's response, the social nature of mind. How can we forget Wittgenstein when it comes to skepticism? Ludwig Wittgenstein critiques the idea that we need to infer other minds at all. He argues that our concept of mind is inseparable from public language and shared practices. If someone behaves as if they are in pain, we do not infer their pain. Rather, pain is a concept we learn through social interactions. The meaning of mental state terms comes from their public usage, not private introspection. 6. In skepticism, we also have the issue of phenomenology and the embodied mind. Phenomenologists like Maurice Merleau-Ponty argue that we perceive other minds directly through embodied interactions. Our lived experience of others involves an immediate, pre-reflective understanding of their mental states, much like how we perceive emotions in facial expressions. Contemporary cognitive science and theory of mind. Cognitive scientists explore how humans, especially children, develop a theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to others. Some argue for a simulation theory where we use our own mental experiences as models to predict others' thoughts. Others support a theory approach where we build a mental framework based on observed patterns. So, skepticism about other minds is difficult to refute entirely. But most philosophers and cognitive scientists accept that we have strong reasons to believe in the existence of other minds. The best explanation of human behavior, our social nature, and our linguistic practices suggests that other minds exist. Rather than requiring a deductive proof, our belief in other minds is part of how we navigate and make sense of the world. So, the problem of other minds, how we can justify the belief that others possesses minds like our own, has generated extensive debates in philosophy. While it might seem that our everyday interactions provide ample evidence of others' mental lives, a critical examination reveals several challenges and layers of complexity. Some of the key arguments, criticisms, and philosophical details could be analyzed as follows, which is the argument from analogy. Then we have the inductive leap problem, and we would like to discuss each one of them. The classical response is to infer that because others exhibit behaviors similar to those we display and experiencing mental states, they too must have minds. For example, when I feel pain, I cry out. When I see someone else cry out in similar circumstances, I infer that they are also experiencing pain. Now, the inductive leap, okay, where the critical analysis part is, this argument rests on an inductive inference from my private experience to the experiences of others. Critics point out that induction does not guarantee certainty. Just because my pain correlates with certain behaviors, it does not logically follow that every similar behavior corresponds to similar subjective experiences. Further, the problem of other minds, we see that radical skeptics argue that this analogy might be misleading. They suggest that while behavior might be similar, it does not necessarily imply that the internal experiences are analogous. In an extreme view, it is conceivable, if highly counterintuitive, that others are philosophical zombies who behave as if they have mental states but lack conscious experience. Inference of the best explanation, or the IBE overview, which is yet another approach that argues that the best explanation for the range of behaviors and communication patterns we observe is that other beings have minds. This is not deduced logically from behavior, but inferred because the hypothesis others have minds provides a more coherent and unified explanation for our social interactions. We have been discussing about the challenges of this entire gamut of problem of skepticism. We had just about picked up the argument from analogy and discussed about it. We will be discussing more in our next lecture. Thank you so much.